right, hello everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming today. I think we will get started. People are still pouring in, but let's get going. We'll start with some easy stuff. There we go. All right. So yeah, welcome. We're using Zoom. So there are some features that I was hoping you will get a little bit more out of this presentation if you are familiar or comfortable using. There's the chat feature, which everyone should hopefully be pretty comfortable. You can either bang the top of your screen or the bottom if you're not seeing this option. There's raise hand if something's wrong. We probably won't do audio. We've got, looks like 95 and rising attendees right now. So it's probably better to type your questions in the chat. Also, actually, there's the Q&A. It's best if your questions are typed there. Those questions will not get lost. Sometimes if there's a lot of chatter in the chat, your question may be lost. So I do encourage questions throughout the presentation. I really like them. I encourage chatter in the chat. If you want to pipe in and say something, by all means, just, be respectful, stay on topic. But yeah, yeah, please, questions as you go. So I'm gonna do a quick, I'm gonna kind of break it into segments. I'll do a little pause to see if there's any questions on that topic before we move on. And that will be the flow of the presentation. All right, so let's get started. So welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about navigating wildlife and water regulations for development. So just a quick disclaimer, there's always a few people who, when we say we're doing environmental regulations, they think it's contaminated sites. We're not talking about contaminated sites here today. That is a different webinar. We can hook you up if you put a note in the chat. I've got Kaylee working in the background, reading the chat, reading the questions. She can redirect you to the right person or the right webinar if that's what you're looking for. Yeah, so like other pension services, if you're interested, Kaylee can redirect you. Health and safety, if you want to do district energy for your developments, we can help you out with that. Kaylee can hook you up. She can redirect you to the right person. Problems with your buildings. If you have bird issues, we are going to touch on that. If you have bird issues on your building, we're not going to go into depth. We do have a different presentation that we focus on birds and buildings, but nevertheless, we kind of, we touch on the regulations associated with those. We're not doing asbestos here, but we do have webinars on that. And hazardous materials for demo, all that stuff. All right. So we're doing wildlife and water. Here's an outline. We're going to start with introductions. I'll introduce myself. I'm going to ask that you introduce yourselves. Don't worry, you don't need to put your camera on. You don't need to say anything. It's multiple choice question. Should be really easy. Give you a sense of kind of who the audience is with us today. Then if anyone's attended this webinar before, I've completely reorganized it this time. I chatted with my wife. She gave me some good advice. She said, "Oh, just talking about the regulations, that sounds really boring. You need project examples." So I've kind of rejigged this presentation in terms of examples, and I've got, I guess, 4 examples where we'll say, okay, here's a project, here's what you got. How do the regulations apply? And then once we've gone through sort of our project examples, where I've called project challenges here, we're going to talk about, what the specific regulations are that we deal with in terms of water and wildlife. And then we're going to do timelines, which is everyone's favorite slide. So get your control, your print screen button ready. These are always changing in terms of how long it takes to, get the different permits. So when I was continually updating that slide, and it's in alignment with what the regulators are saying in terms of how long it's going to take for those things to come back. And then we're going to talk about regulatory changes. I assume, a lot of people are here for that. Like, you kind of get a sense of how it works already, but you want to know, what's new, what's different, what to look out for on the horizon. We're going to cover that right at the end. All right. So welcome. My name is Brennan Ensti. I'm the I guess I head up we're called the environmental science group internally in Pynchon. I often call it the fish and wildlife permitting group because that's essentially what we do. We look at streams, we look at fish, we look at wildlife, we figure out what sort of permits are required for changes to land or changes to those features. I've been in consulting for almost 20 years now. I used to say more than 15, but I think we're at 20. I've always been doing environmental. I really like it. I worked doing on a few major construction projects in the past. Really very hands-on. Last week we found a snake. My wildlife biologist found it, so that's a very recent picture. Patrick, if you're on the line, you just missed it. I think we found it 2 minutes after you left. And I've got, I have most of my team online. They're watching and kind of in the wings. So if something happens to me, Kaylee may put someone else in charge, and I apologize, team, you may have to take over, but I should be good to continue. And I'd like to find out a little bit about you. I see we've got 121 people registered. I checked the list earlier. I knew about 50%, but it would be really nice to know, yeah, sort of where you're coming from. I'll share the results, and then also you got a sense of kind of, what kind of crowd is with you. So if you could please, yeah, we'll leave this up for 20 seconds. Hopefully the poll is showed up on your screen. If not, it should be coming shortly. It kind of depends on internet speed. Yeah, so I'll let you pick that. For those who have completed the poll, I've got a pop question for you. As we stare at the background of this picture, which of these plants is commonly associated with Oregon forest snail? My team is not allowed to answer. Okay, hold your thoughts on that one. So it looks like the results are, we have 11% developers, 7% regulators. Thank you to all the regulators who joined. I know City of Mission, City of Abbotsford, City of Surrey, provincial regulators have all told me that they were coming. Thank you very much. That means a lot that you're here, and feel free to pipe in the chat if you're answering other people's questions, or if I'm saying something you want to clarify, by all means, absolutely. That is why I invited you here. Oh, lots of planners, 18%, 1% architect. Thank you for coming. 35% engineers, welcome engineers. 1% broker, and 28% other. Thank you all for coming. That is excellent, and thanks for filling out the poll. All right, next poll, last poll before we get into it. What do you want to know? When I developed this presentation, I think about all the questions that my clients have asked me, or that people are often confused about, and I've created it based on that. But I will try and spend a little bit extra time on whatever it is that you are interested in. So yeah, click the multiple choice if your answer is there. If you wanted to learn something else, click that and then throw your question into the Q&A, so that whatever I want to answer everybody's questions if I can. The Q&A also gets recorded, so if I don't answer the question during the presentation, I will follow up and get back to you. Or maybe I don't know the answer to the question, maybe I don't have a good answer, so I can look it up and get back to you after the webinar. I'm not sure if anyone, just gonna check the chat. Need a category for biologists, sorry, Pamela. You could maybe be regulator. I'm aging myself. Okay. Okay, we should be just about the answer to my last question for Oregon forest snail. It was stinging nettles. So there's a couple stinging nettles. There's one growing kind of out of the U on the back of the slide. And there is one just above the and the wet. It's a cool plant. It can sting you. I get stung every season on purpose because I have a habit of eating it. You can make good tea out of it. It's really healthy. It's like, one of those leafy greens. It's probably a superfood if the food industry ever caught onto it. Okay, the answers were, people, 63% want to know what environmental regulations apply to developments. 47% want to know what are the current anticipated timelines for environmental Ooh, I've lost my questions. For environmental permitting processes, 69% want to know what are the recent changes. Yes, that's always an exciting topic. I love talking about that. Ooh, and only 2% wanted to know something else. Good, so I've gotten most of it covered. All right, thank you, crowd. You've given me some energy. Okay, let's continue. Next slide. Okay, so this is the way that I've broken up the presentation. I'm going to give examples like this. So this is going to be one of our examples. I'm going to say, okay, we have these features. This is your site. What does it mean? Before we get to that, I'm going to give you the hard stuff. Don't worry about it. You're going to see this again. You don't need to absorb it all now. I'm just going to really quickly talk about what the regulations are. We're going to look at the examples. I'm going to bring this back. We're going to review what the regulations are, and we're going to move on. So there are often multiple regulations on some features. So there's the municipal layer. Sometimes it's usually in the bylaws. It's in different places in different municipalities. Sometimes it's in the development bylaw. Sometimes they have a water and sewerage bylaw. There might be like sediment erosion stuff. There may be stream stuff in there. There may be some tree related bylaws. There may be some wildlife related bylaws. And then at the provincial level, the one we deal with the most is probably the Water Sustainability Act. And the two most common processes that we use within that act are an approval or a notification. There's a new process called a stream determination process. I'm going to talk about that later. Another one that you've probably heard of is the Riparian Areas Protection Regulation. It used to be called just the Riparian Areas Regulation, and they throw in the P. So it used to be the RAR, and now it's the RAPR, which I think is a much better acronym. And also there's the Provincial Wildlife Act, which protects wildlife itself. For anyone working on really large projects, there is the BC Environmental Assessment Act. I would say it's more rare that you get into this. You're gonna kind of know if you have a really big project that you need the BC Environmental Assessment Act. If you're not sure, you check the regulated, I think it's called the Regulated Projects Regulations, where they have a big list. I looked at it last night to see if I thought anyone would have stuff. If you're building like a wastewater treatment plant or like there's a list. Your project would have to be pretty big to be on that list. Maybe a resort, resorts are on there for some reason. And then at the federal level, we've got Fisheries and Oceans Canada. It used to be called Department of Fisheries and Oceans, DFO. I still have trouble switching to FOC instead of calling them DFO because I'm just so used to saying DFO. There's the Migratory Birds Convention Act, protecting migratory birds, so protecting birds that migrate. And there's the Species at Risk Act, protecting species at risk, as well as the Impact Assessment Act. So that applies, so that's kind of like the environmental process for projects on federal land, and maybe for like mega projects under federal jurisdiction, as well as First Nations. This is becoming an increasing regulator, I guess you could say. We're on First Nations traditional territory. Often there's overlapping traditional territories. They have their own laws, their own rights. As we move through this process of kind of national reconciliation, we need to pay more attention to whose traditional territories we're on and what their laws and rights are, particularly in the land development industry. So we'll talk more about that as we get in there. Okay, so that was kind of dry. We're going to move into some projects. It's going to get exciting real quick. So here we go. All right, so we have a piece of land. Let's imagine we're in the interior. Pynchon has offices in Victoria, Lower Mainland, and Kelowna. Those are our biggest hubs, but we do work all over BC. So let's say we're in the interior. I'm going to start at the transactional phase, and we'll kind of move our way through the development cycle with the different examples. So let's say we need a piece of land for something, like maybe we want to build, I don't know, a space observatory, or we want to build some housing, or we want to build a government institutional building, or a school, whatever it is. Want to build something. So you have this land. We often do what's called like a transactional environmental assessment, which is like a quick high level, you know, people often don't want to spend a lot of money before they've actually committed to the property. So they say, hey, I found this land, it looks really good. Can you do a quick check to see what environmental features we have? So turns out there's a giant wetland on the bottom corner. That's why it's kind of a funny color. You're like, yeah, something weird's going on there. Someone should go take a look. We took a look, turns out you have a wetland. What does that mean? Wetlands are considered streams under the Water Sustainability Act and regulation. So they are protected. You cannot just develop on them. There's typically also some sort of buffer associated with them. You may be able to infill that wetland and put it somewhere else. Like say if it was, I don't know, this long skinny feature in the middle of your site, it didn't provide a lot of say like habitat value where it was kind of like a low borderline wetland. It may make sense for you to consider going through the permitting process to put it in a more desirable location that may be better environmentally. And we'll talk about that in some other features. But for the transactional process, all you want to know is, yes, there is either, yes, there's a wetland, or yes, there's a potentially large wetland on your site. At the transactional stage, you're also going to want to know about all your streams. So it turns out the reason why there's a bunch of trees running down there is because there is a stream. Streams are protected. They also have typically a buffer around them that is protected. So there could be a fairly sizable chunk of land there that's going to be a little bit either probably undevelopable, really. And if you want to do any crossings, you're going to require some permits, and we try to avoid crossings wherever possible. If you absolutely need them, say it's the only way to access your site, then yes, it's doable. And typically crossings, if designed properly, are not too much of a permitting headache. We can do it through a notification. And since you're in the interior, surprise, you also got rattlesnakes. So maybe we're out on site and we found, maybe during the desktop review, we found that we're within rattlesnake habitat, or maybe when we're on site, we found some skins, or maybe we saw a rattlesnake. Rattlesnakes are a protected species at risk, so you are not allowed to harm, harass, or kill a rattlesnake. Rattlesnakes have hibernacula, meaning like a hole in the rock somewhere where they all hang out. If you wipe that out, you wipe out all the rattlesnakes. So you don't want to do that. That would be extra illegal, more so than killing one rattlesnake. So that will be an issue, and you're going to want to consider that in your development. And what that'll basically spark a conversation in terms of like, what are you trying to do with this property? And if there are rattlesnakes, rattlesnake habitat on your property in particular areas, because they do favor some areas over others, is it possible to develop a part of your property, but maybe not all of your property? Or, is it possible to coexist or not? That will be an important question to consider prior to purchasing the site. Okay, I think that's it for the features on this one. Are there any questions on the transactional phase of the project or on this example in particular? Kaylee, do you see any questions?
Yes, so can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so it says, are wetland SBs affected by if they're directly connected to a water course?
Wetland setbacks affected? Yes, absolutely. It's a leading question. Yes. So there is a difference, and maybe I will touch on it. I'm gonna touch on that on the next example because it's a bit easier to see. But yes, it's a big difference between whether or not a stream or a wetland is connected downstream, or whether it just goes to ground. I got a better example for that in the next slide. Any other questions there, Kelly?
Yeah, we have one here. It says, for wetland determination, how are you advising with the disparity in definitions? So what constitutes a stream between the RAPR and WSA, especially for isolated wetlands that might not be captured under RAPR, but maybe under WSA?
It's a very good question. I'm also going to cover that in the next slide.
Okay. So that is it for now.
Okay. All right. thank you for the leading questions. Let's get to the next slide and figure all that out. Okay, so most of the effort goes in when you have a site and you're like, all right, I'm ready to develop it. Then you really need to understand your environmental features, what it means, the nuances, the exact shape, everything. So here we go. So it's a different site. Let's say we're in, I don't know, Langford. So maybe that's the ocean poking up in the bottom right corner. We got some features, a wetland again. It could also be a pond, a lake. From a regulatory perspective, it's pretty similar. So let's address one of the questions we had there. So does it make a difference if it's connected downstream? It absolutely does. So whether or not it's connected downstream, so say right now, so say it's isolated, it's just a, it's a low spot in the ground, it's wet, there's wet vegetation in there, there's hydric soils. It's a wetland for sure, but it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't flow to fish habitat, doesn't have fish in it. What does that mean? It's going to be protected under the Water Sustainability Act and regulations as a stream. So it's protected inherently in and of itself. It's going to require some sort of buffer around the edges. If you develop right up to the edges of the wetland, you'll probably destroy its banks. So not only the wetland itself, but the wetland and its edges are protected. So there will be some sort of buffer associated around it. And you also need to consider for development planning, if you develop immediately up gradient of that wetland, is that going to affect the hydrology in a way that it's going to dry out your wetland? And this is a pretty common scenario, unfortunately, particularly in the past, maybe not so much now. I think we're getting a bit wiser and we're kind of understanding, how hydrology works. But I guess the knowledge base is there to know that, yeah, if you cut off the water source to this wetland and dry it up, you are effectively destroying the wetland, which you're not allowed to do. So that is important. And then, as the question mentioned, if this wetland is connected, so say this wetland is connected via surface flow, so there is some sort of channel that at some time in the year, water flows out of this wetland and into, say it's the ocean, or it could also be like a fish-bearing stream. Anything that has fish in it, then all of a sudden, additional regulations apply. The Fisheries Act then applies because it is flowing to fish. And even though it may not have fish in it itself, because it flows to an area that has fish in it, it becomes fish habitat. It's providing water, it's providing nutrients, and therefore DFO, the Fisheries Act likely applies, and you would need to consult DFO prior to making any changes kind of in and around it. Furthermore, if you are in one of the more populated areas of BC, like the Lower Mainland, Victoria area, Kelowna area, the wrapper applies. So the riparian areas protection regulation applies, which means that there is a very defined process for establishing the setback on both the wetland as well as that channel that flows downstream, and any of the streams for that matter. So wetlands get a pretty big setback. Under the wrapper, it's, 30 meters on the south side and 15 meters on the other sides. So you could overlay, so for development planning, you would overlay those setbacks onto your wetland and onto that channel to get an idea of which areas are not protected and available for development. Okay, that's a bit of a mouthful. Hopefully that made sense. Here's another example. So here we have a stream that flows to ground. It comes down, and then I guess there's a bunch of, kind of porous material, and the water just kind of sinks down into the ground. Is this a realistic scenario? Absolutely. We've got a bunch of projects where the water just kind of sinks into ground and it doesn't pop back up for, some time, if ever. So how is that protected? So unlike the scenario where our wetland was connected to the ocean, if this one is disconnected, it only flows to ground, maybe it only has water in it a few months of the year, or when it rains really hard. Is it still a stream? yes, it's still a stream. It's still protected under the water sustainability regulations. You can't just go infill it. You would need a permit to make any changes to it and even to cross it. But it has no fish in it. It has no connection to downstream. So the wrapper does not apply. And the Fisheries Act also does not apply. And so this is a source of a lot of confusion on projects. Because we're used to putting wrappers on streams. You know, why does the wetland get it, but the stream doesn't? This is why, because there is no surficial connection to downstream fish habitat. And as a result, those other regulations drop out, but the water sustainability regulation stays. Okay, and then, you know, this stream, it goes to the ocean. So it goes to fish habitat, which means we have the water sustainability regulation protects it. The riparian areas protection regulation protects it. The Fisheries Act protects it. And there may also be a municipal layer over top. Maybe there's a municipal streamside bylaw that protects more than the wrapper. The wrapper is kind of like a meet or beat scenario. Municipalities have the option to say, okay, well, you know, the wrapper says it's a 10-meter setback. We're going to say it's 15 meters for all these types of streams because we want to, you know, do an extra diligent job of protecting our streams. So you could have 4 overlapping regulations on top of streams, which is why everyone kind of knows, yeah, you have a stream, you need to protect it. There's a lot going on there. And finally, surprise, surprise, you also have a giant stick nest on your site. Eagles can have, I don't know, 3 to 5 different nests. There might not be an eagle in it, but that nest is still protected under the Wildlife Act. Really big stick nests are protected. So the nests of, what is it, hawks, eagles, gerfalcons, owls, it's that big one. Herons, they're protected year round, whether or not the birds and the chicks and the eggs are in there or not, under the Provincial Wildlife Act. So you have an eagle's nest. There might not even be an eagle. It's still protected. There's typically a fairly large buffer around eagle's nest, like a couple 100 meters. It kind of depends. And so what does that mean for your development? Are you planning to develop on that side? Are you in the riparian buffer already anyway? So that nest is going to stay. If the nest does stay, can you construct close to it? Or are you going to be too close? Are you going to disturb any eagles that are potentially in that nest, causing them to vacate and never use it again? Those are questions that you would need to sort out. It is possible, you know, if you absolutely had to, say the eagle's nest was right in the middle of the site and you're like, you know what, this eagle's nest kind of makes my site undevelopable. It's just not working. It is possible to relocate a nest when really it's sort of like you're destroying the nest and you're creating a new platform somewhere else for the eagles to use. It's had, you know, questionable, kind of marginal success, but it has been done. The precedent has been set. There is a permitting process for it. It does take a while. But that is potentially an option if it's necessary. And really that's the question that the regulatory folk are gonna ask. Are you doing it just because you want to, or is it really necessary? So you need to have a pretty good argument for doing that. All right, any questions on this project example?
There's nothing in here yet.
Okay. All right, I see. Okay, I see a question from Pamela. I think that's more for the crowd. So if you guys are monitoring the chat, feel free to jump into the chat in terms of your biggest challenges going through the development process. And I am going to move on. I see 2 questions.
We have 2 questions here.
Yes.
Yeah. So is there a limit to the streams leading to the water or the ocean?
Yeah, Kyle, I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Is there a limit? I'm not sure which limit you mean. Like, yeah, as many streams as possible. There's no limit to the number of streams. And yeah, not 100% sure on the question. Kyle, if you maybe want to like elaborate, and can you elaborate on the nest relocation? Sure. So essentially you can get a permit to remove the, like nests are protected, you can get a permit to remove them. Typically the wildlife branch in charge of that will say, okay, yes, you can take it down, but what are you going to do for compensation? And a similar kind of rationale applies to streams. Like, sure, you can infill the stream in the middle that goes to ground, but what are you going to do to compensate for it? And what the regulator is typically looking for is something of equal or greater ecological value, and of kind of similar ecological value. So if, you know, the stream is providing water to ground, then they're going to say, okay, well, whatever you're compensating with also should be providing water to ground. Or if the stream provides amphibian habitat, then whatever you're compensating for should also provide amphibian habitat, and it should be located you know, fairly nearby. So if you're really relocating the eagle's nest, they're going to want to see it relocated in a, you know, similar location and to provide a similar function to what it's providing right now. So right now it's pretty close to the ocean. You got a good ocean view. You're close to this channel. They would want to see you relocate it to a similar area, providing similar characteristics to where it is now, so that they, you know, the eagle's like, all right, fair enough. You've took away my house, but you've provided me an equivalent house. I'm happy to also, you know, set up a nest there instead. I know there are some specialists who deal with that. I went to a conference a couple of years ago, and actually what they found is that if they build what looks like a hawk's, they tried building eagle's nest, but the eagles are like, yeah, no, I'm not really into it. But if they built a hawk's nest, then the eagle would be like, oh, score, I'm going to go build my nest on top of that hawk's nest. And they were having some better success with it. So there's some cool tricks for being successful with that. All right. Let's move on to the next example. Okay, so I'm getting more and more complex as we move on. Here we're getting to a construction example. So we've done our development permitting planning processes. We've applied for all our permits before construction, as we should, because some of those permits take a really long time. And if you wait till construction to apply for your permits, you're going to get delayed. There's really no way around it. So typically, you know, when we're doing our development planning, we say, okay, what are going to be the longest permits that we're going to apply for? And we apply for those ones first. You know, some permits take, you know, about 2 years to come back. So we go after those. We figure out, you know, what are the details we need to know for these, figure that out, apply for those first. And the ones that, you know, have kind of a shorter time frame, we can wait until we've kind of fleshed out our development plan in more detail before we go for those. All right, so in this one, the scenario is we've got an access road that crosses a stream. I'm going to bring up the site in a minute. But just a quick note on the stream crossings. So stream crossings are doable. If you can do a clear span bridge, that's the best. If it's a really small stream, you want to do a culvert, that's okay too. There are some design criteria to make sure that we can permit it under a notification, which means it's a fairly quick turnaround. If you can't fulfill those design requirements, it does become an approval, and that is the 18-month long kind of permitting process, which is not ideal. So definitely make sure that your design of your stream crossing conforms to the notification. It's almost always doable to conform. So it's just a matter of building it the right way. So there's our site. So, you know, that's actually our land, the access road. We're just kind of, you know, we're tuning it up so we can access our site because we're going to be using a lot more. Maybe it's an old forest road or something like that. We have, you've probably heard the word SPIA, which stands for Streamside Protection and Enhancement Area. It can be called riparian setback or buffer. It's got lots of different names. The point is that it's a no-go zone around both the stream. See, we've kind of protected on the left side to the stream, as well as we got the Fraser River up there, which typically might have like a 30-meter setback. So we're leaving a really big buffer on that one as a major stream system. What else we got? The ground slopes this way. So because we have streams on site, because we have steep ground, if we go in there and clear the land and start mucking up the dirt, and it rains real hard, it's going to bring dirty water into, or potentially bring dirty water into the stream and the river, which we don't want to do, and B, often the municipality will require us to have protection so that we do not do that. It's also a contravention to the Fisheries Act if dirty water gets into streams with fish. potentially also the Water Sustainability Act that prevents deleterious substances from getting in the water. So you're going to want to have a good sediment erosion control plan for your site, and to make sure that it's both monitored and being followed by your constructor. So if it's a relatively flat, benign site, often it makes more sense for the civil engineers to draw up the ESC design. They've already got the site design developed, so you might as well slap a few ESC things if it's kind of low risk. They're out there checking on the site construction anyway. They might as well check up on ESC. But if it's more complicated, that might be the time where you want an environmental consultant involved, and someone who's particularly good at sediment erosion control to design your sediment erosion control plan and be out there monitoring to make sure it's successful. Furthermore, especially for larger projects, the way that you set up your contract with your contractor can make a big difference in terms of compliance with sediment erosion control. So often people people might forget about sediment erosion control to the end, or it's just kind of slapped on as, oh yeah, and by the way, do sediment erosion control, Mr. Contractor. But the incentives to comply are not necessarily there, and the constructor may make a lot of money by ignoring that and not having good compliance. So the way that you set up your contract with your contractor is important, particularly for larger projects, to get compliance with sediment erosion control. So if you need any help with that, we can help with that, because I have lots of ideas. So you also have a ditch, and this comes up a lot. So we have a ditch on our access road. It's an old ditch. It was man-made, but in order to, we're upgrading our access road. So we need to make it, another meter or two wide on the bottom side, which means we need to move our ditch over a couple meters. Does that require a permit? The answer is usually. It's very rare that you wouldn't. There is a scenario where you might not need a permit, and that scenario would be where the ditch only conveys surface flows. There's no groundwater or headwater influence, and the ditch also doesn't drain downstream. So maybe that ditch kind of goes into the forest and soaks into the ground, and there's no connection to downstream habitat. So in that case, if we are 100% confident that that ditch is not a stream, then it's not a stream under the WSA. It doesn't connect downstream, so the Fisheries Act doesn't apply. The wrapper does not apply because it doesn't connect downstream. It truly is an unregulated feature, and therefore it can be infilled, moved, whatever, without a permit. But that's fairly rare. Most of the time, ditches do connect downstream. So even if the ditch, say it's not regulated under the Water Sustainability Act because there's no groundwater or headwater going into that ditch, if it connects downstream, it still falls under the protection of the riparian areas protection regulation. Typically a ditch gets a 2-meter setback, as well as the Fisheries Act, because it flows downstream and it's providing water to downstream. So you'd want to check in with DFO before you infilled that stream. If you're really unsure, and this question comes up a lot, it's a really big question, is this ditch a stream or not? It was man-made. The province has come up with what's called the stream determination process or methodology, where we study, gather lots of evidence on that ditch. We look at it under different conditions, particularly in the winter. So between the fall and kind of, the end of March, the wettest season, to try and see, is there any groundwater seepage into that ditch? Because that is typically the determinant on whether or not that is a stream. If we have all the evidence and we say, hey, you know what, we studied it in the wet season, there is no groundwater influence, or, there's no possible way that groundwater could get in there, then it's not a stream. But if there is, it is a stream. Nothing you can do about it. Regulations apply, and you've got to navigate your way through there. All right, you might also have amphibians there. Amphibians can be salvaged and moved out of the way for construction. It's pretty typical. You may have fish in your stream. Say you're rebuilding the crossing. You're going to need an amphibian salvage permit. You're going to need a fish salvage permit. Typically we get those. It's kind of double regulated, so we'll get them from both DFO as well as the province. It doesn't take too long. It's maybe a month or two. It's not quite like the wildlife permit timeline that I'm going to get to in a minute. That's for kind of some more complicated species. And surprise, you also got Oregon forest snail on your site. You got a bunch of maples and stinging nettle. So it's a good chance you're going to have Oregon forest snail. When we did our EA for development planning, we found a bunch of Oregon forest snail shells. So you'll need to do a salvage and find another home for those Oregon forest snails, which are a species at risk under the legislation, since they're snails and pretty common in the region. It's not too cumbersome of a process to move them out of the way, but they do need to be moved out of the way during your project. Okay, so that was construction. That was a lot. Hopefully that all made sense. Any questions, Kaylee, on this project example, or audience, if you want to type something in there?
We have a question here. How are you advising on stream crossings where there's also a need to integrate wildlife connectivity? So have you dealt with any such situations where a separate dry culvert is needed, or any situations where directional fencing is identified as being necessary as well?
Very excellent leading question. Yes, I have. Yeah, we've had a few, a few crossings where, yeah, as the question mentioned, you know, maybe you have your culvert for the stream and then you have a separate dry culvert for animal passage, or maybe you just oversize your initial culvert. It kind of depends on the configuration of the stream, what makes sense. Often oversizing is a better idea because, and it really depends on what kind of animals you're expecting to go through. So, yes, that is an option. If clear span bridge, you know, it is more expensive. Maybe that doesn't make sense. Throwing in an extra culvert is usually a pretty cheap solution and can provide good connectivity for whatever kind of creatures you want to allow passage for. If, say, there's a couple wetlands and you're providing connectivity, having that connection can be really important so that the creatures are not getting ran over on the road, which is a huge source of mortality for small creatures, particularly, you know, amphibians and frogs. The classic Frogger game is kind of based on real life, and it's pretty tough for them. So yes, and then directional fencing, especially for amphibians, directing them so that they cannot play the Frogger game on the road and they are forced into the wildlife tunnel is pretty important. So that is a good strategy for those creatures. And it's becoming more and more, I guess, both established as like a common way of doing it, and yeah, essentially people are getting better at it. We're you know, I think the first few tunnels maybe not so successful, but now we're pretty successful. We've got a few tunnels in and we've got some wildlife cameras in them, and yeah, the wildlife are using them. It works. Any other questions, Kelly?
We have one here. It says, when you dig a ditch, isn't it often the case you get an influx from the groundwater? How does that work, as you have created a stream without realizing this?
All right. I'm just rereading the question. When you dig a ditch, isn't it often the case you get an influx of groundwater? How does that work, as you have created a stream with? Yes. The unfortunate answer is yes. You can create streams by digging a ditch. If you dig down into the groundwater, you have essentially created a stream, and there is no allowance to say, oh, well, we created it, so we can just fill it back in. Unfortunately, as soon as you create it, it gets protected, and it falls under the regulations. So most of the time. So yes, what we often advise our clients is you can create a French drain, but if you create a ditch that has groundwater flowing through it, you are creating a stream. Sometimes there's some allowances, particularly in construction sites, because it's like, okay, no, this is construction water flow. But we've also had a site where it was a temporary diversion, but by temporary, it was like over a decade. And because it had been so long, our temporary diversion became a stream, and there was no forgiveness. We're like, hey, but this was, you know, a temporary measure. We're going to do something else. And they're like, no, sorry, it's been too long. It's now a stream. So you want to be very careful with temporary diversions of groundwater. you know, a year or two is reasonable. If it goes on beyond that, then you may be creating a stream. And you probably don't want to design that into your design, depending on the location. So very good question. Okay, just checking the time. So I'm going to move on because we have some important slides to get to next. Regional. Okay, I'm going to expand your brains here for a minute. So and for all you planners, if you want, you're going to want to pay extra special attention to this one. So when we're looking at things at the higher level, like the neighborhood level or the municipal level, in terms of like, you know, what even kind of environmental regulations should we have as a municipality? Here are some hot tips to consider. Aquatic and terrestrial connectivity is really important. You know, we have a lot of birds in urban areas because they can fly. They have the connectivity, they can move around. But we don't have a lot of terrestrial creatures, and a lot of the aquatic passages have been cut off through kind of like either too long culverts or poorly installed culverts or eroded culverts where, you know, the fish can no longer pass up into the locations where they used to be able to go. So tip of the hat to City of Surrey, their green infrastructure network essentially maps out all of the terrestrial connectivities for the entire municipality. And they have the process to ensure that those connections are created as the city develops. I think they're one of the, I think they do it the best of all the municipalities that I've worked in. So that is something to consider for both neighborhood planning and also kind of for, you know, municipal planning as well. It's really critical. Subsurface hydrology in soils is huge. And it's also a real challenge for development. I mean, you know, the typical development process is you know, cut everything down, drain the water out, and then, you know, it makes it right for development from an engineering perspective, but it also is quite harmful from an environmental perspective. So finding that balance between keeping the water in the ground and you know, retaining those natural hydrological pathways, which not only feed the streams, but also feed the soils and, you know, all the trees. That's what they're drinking. That's keeping them alive. If we drain that out, then, you know, all the plants who need the soils moist may be struggling and might die off. So that is a huge challenge and something that should be considered at the neighborhood level. You know, you look at your geotech information, you can look at the ground, you can look at how porous the soils are and come up with you know, a strategy, I guess, for retaining the subsurface hydrology, particularly in the context of the ecological features that you want to keep as part of that neighborhood plan. Wetlands are becoming an increasing issue, I think, for a couple of reasons, because because a lot of the non-wetland has already been developed, and B, because I think our awareness of the importance of wetlands is increasing, as well as, I guess, like living ecosystems or wildlife. If you have an isolated park that's completely surrounded by development and there's no way for, you know, there's no connectivity, then it's going to be difficult for wildlife to get in. And furthermore, wildlife is really good at hiding. Like, you'd be amazed at some of the wildlife that's out there that people just don't know about, that's kind of almost right in front of them. So as our knowledge of these animals increases, so is our ability to know what they need in order to survive in perpetuity. And First Nations as well. Looking at the neighborhood or the municipal level, knowing whose traditional territories you're on is huge. And I would argue, you know, it's best done at kind of the neighborhood or municipal level. At the site level, sure, you can do it, and you should if you don't know, but that's something that is much better managed for everybody, both the development community as well as First Nations. If they can deal, you know, with larger sections of their traditional territory, it's more worth their time than dealing, you know, it's hard for them to pay attention to every little site that's getting developed. It's just too much. All right, so regulatory and timelines. So here's a quick rehash of the regulations. The same slides I showed you before. We have the municipal layer of bylaws. Often these municipal bylaws are enforcing the provincial and federal rules, but they can have their own added twist or extras that are particularly important to that municipality. At the provincial level, we have our Water Sustainability Act. Normally, we go for an approval or notification. We have our stream determination process. If we're not sure, is this actually a stream or not? It's most, especially for ditches. We have the riparian areas protection regulation that applies in most populated centers. It's also a pretty standard methodology. So even if you're outside of those areas, practitioners will often use that as a way to ensure that fisheries habitats and values are being protected. As well as the Wildlife Act. Going to skip the BCEAA. At the federal level, we've got Fisheries Oceans Canada. We've got the Migratory Birds Convention Act protecting birds and their nests. So that's anytime there is active bird nesting. I guess I didn't talk about that, so there's a good opportunity for question if anyone has questions on that. Species at Risk Act, protecting species at risk, and the IAA and First Nations. So I'm just burning down to the end. So, First Nations also may have their own laws or rules. What I have been seeing when I look at what they are interested in, usually where they start is they say, hey, you need to follow all of the provincial and federal environmental rules. And that's kind of their starting point. And then from there, they may layer on kind of their own requirements in terms of, like, they might have an environmental code or a land management code or something like that. But typically as a baseline, they want you to follow the provincial and federal environmental regulations. So, okay, here's a slide that everyone gets excited about. How long does it take to get a permit? Wrappers typically take, they used to be, I think maybe a couple of years ago, it was 2 weeks. Now it's more like 2 months. And we're getting lots of questions on particularly the more complicated wrapper assessments. So it's not an easy, oh yeah, 2 months, we get it back and everything's all good. It's, sometimes it is, but sometimes it's 2 months and then there's more questions and we've got to kind of rejig things, go into some more detail and resubmit. Wildlife permits. So this is there was a question on the eagle's nest. If you want, this is if you wanted to remove like an eagle's nest or something like that. This isn't like a fish salvage permit or amphibian salvage permit. Those are fairly quick. We can get those in like a month, maybe 2 weeks, if everything's moving pretty fast and it's a big hurry. Typically a month for salvages, but kind of 3 to 8 months for this kind of permit. And I guess like the less strong your argument is to remove, the longer it's going to take, because they're kind of waiting for like a really good rationale before they say, yeah, okay, go ahead. You can destroy this protected feature. For WSA approvals, this is the big one. We're at about 18 months. I just got one back a couple of weeks ago and it was pretty much 18 months. So that's what the ministry is telling us. That's what we're seeing. This is if, say, you want to infill a stream and provide some compensation habitat somewhere, you want to infill a wetland, provide some compensation habitat somewhere. After we get ourselves figure out and know exactly, okay, yeah, we're going to do exactly this, we're going to fill it in, we're going to create it here, here's all the conditions. There's a bunch of work that goes into prepping it, maybe 4 to 6 months depending on how advanced our design is. It's going to be 18 months after we submit before we can get the approval, assuming that we get it. DFO, so DFO's back in the picture. They updated the regulations in 2019 and they hired a tremendous amount of staff, including some of my staff from my team, including some people that I was trying to hire. They've just been on a hiring frenzy. They've got tons of new people. They've been trained up and kind of working for about a year or two, and now they're starting to get involved in projects and they're starting to ask questions. Whereas before, it was not it wasn't really an issue. We wouldn't get a lot of feedback from them for the most part, especially with fairly benign things like, say, there's no fish there, but it flows to fish. DFO is like, all right, yeah, just keep the water clean. It's all good. And now they're asking for things like riparian habitat along the edges of these non-fish bearing streams. So there's more involvement from DFO. So that's why 2 months plus, like maybe it's 2 months for them to get back to us, but now they're asking questions whereas they never used to. For DFO authorizations, we haven't actually field tested this one. DFO authorization would be, so say you're destroying fish habitat or you have to do something that's going to kill fish, then you need a DFO authorization to do so. So say you have a fish bearing stream and you're infilling it for some reason and you're going to provide compensation somewhere else, that would require a DFO authorization most likely. I imagine that the process is going to be timeline will be somewhat similar to the WSA, and you are probably going to end up doing a DFO authorization and a WSA approval at the same time in parallel. So it's going to be kind of a similar application prep and probably a similar timeline on getting that back. So that's probably, you know, one of the most complicated processes to go through. It's doable, but you know, you need the time to kind of wait it out. So if you can avoid it, if at all possible, you know, that's typically what we try and advise our clients to do. Municipal permitting, it really depends on the municipality. I think Surrey probably has the most extensive process. A lot of the smaller municipalities, you know, might not have much of a process at all. They're just like, I don't know, follow the provincial and feds, and if you do that, then you're good. So yeah, that's it for timelines and regulatory changes. I'm just going to do a quick time check. Got time. All right. So environmental permitting, increased timelines. When I updated that timeline slide, nothing got shorter. More DFO involvement, already covered that. So both the Impact Assessment Act, the BC Environmental Assessment Act, and DFO all got refreshed in 2019. And there's going to be an evolution of the policy that surrounds that. So I mean, I suspect like the regulators are still kind of figuring out the minutia of like, oh, okay, well, when this happens, then, you know, let's do it like this. And, you know, here's a streamlined process for this where it's lower risk. That's going to evolve. Here's a new one that I haven't chatted about yet. The Ministry of Forest, Lands and Natural Resource Operations, FLNRO, which is responsible for the Water Sustainability Act, has split their ministry into the Ministry of Forest and the Ministry of Land and Water something, land and water something resource, I can't remember. Anyways, what I have been told from the regulators that I deal with in terms of permit applications is that they're staying with Ministry of Forests and not too much is changing. But I think how it's going to work is I think LWARS may have more of an enforcement role. I know that they have been hiring more enforcers. We got a little bit of conversation around some enforcement a couple of years ago, and then it kind of went quiet, but I suspect that's the direction that they're moving is, you know, Forest might be the permitting wing, and then LWARS may be kind of the more enforcey kind of wing. Regulators, if you know more than me, by all means, please chime in the chat. I don't know a lot about that. We're going to kind of watch and see how it goes. First Nations reconciliation is going to be a big piece where that has been baked into the updates of both DFO and IAA. So there's more onus on, you know, meaningful, you know, prior informed consent and consultation, as well as recognition that, you know, we're moving through this reconciliation process. So if I've been reading the calls to action from the federal process for, excuse me, for truth and reconciliation. And, you know, a lot of the calls to action are for government. So if anyone is working in government, I strongly urge you to read those calls to action because they definitely apply to you. There are some for the business community and some that very much do apply to the development community. So it's good to read those and kind of have a think about, you know, what this really means. I was having a chat with one of our good developer clients about this recently. I sent them a bunch of information on, you know, here's a bunch of archaeologists, here's kind of like a good place to start. And usually where, you know, it starts with the land acknowledgement, like knowing whose traditional territory are you on and what kind of changes are you proposing to make? And, you know, does that jive? Have you asked, you know, have you asked for consent? Would it be in line with your understanding of the values and, you know, is there any opportunity to, are you providing an opportunity to engage with First Nations, or are you just ignoring them and blindly kind of going forward with the development? That's not intended to be, you know, a negative in any way. it's, you know, it's a process, and it's, you know, often, you know, brings up a lot of emotions and feelings, but it's important to kind of, you know, lean into that discomfort, because that's where we grow. Okay, wetlands and wildlife. As I mentioned, there's going to be, you know, I think that's a level or a features where we're going to see more and more involvement and possibly even regulation. A couple of years ago, we noticed a bunch of the provincial species at risk were getting updated in a frenzy, and we thought that maybe there'd be some more teeth to the Provincial Wildlife Act, because right now only the animals are protected, their habitats are not. So often the habitat gets wiped out, and, you know, the animal, maybe it can move on somewhere else, but maybe it can't. And so there's a bit of a gap there. And public and enforcement. The public, you know, a lot of people with their cameras out there keeping an eye on things, and enforcement, like I mentioned. And that wraps us up. So I'm going to stick around for questions. If you got to drop off, it's 11 o'clock. Thank you for sticking around this long. But yeah, we can do maybe, I don't know, maybe 5 more minutes of questions. Kind of race to the end. I guess we did questions as we went. But yeah, Kaylee, any high level questions? I'll cut this off at 11:05.
We have some questions here, some that we've accumulated throughout the session. So one question here from Victoria. Do you have any seminars that focus on dewatering of a site during construction with high water tables, and what the process is for PTTW?
We don't have any seminars specifically on groundwater dewatering. I will mention that for dewatering excavations, if you're pumping out groundwater, there are a few exemptions, particularly for the municipalities doing utility works. But if you are not under an exempt category, chances are you do need a permit to extract groundwater for your construction. It surprises a lot of people. I'm sure a lot of people do it without getting permits. I haven't heard of a lot of enforcement. I'm not saying to do it without the permit. I've heard that the permit is fairly easy to get, and if it's mentioned that it's for construction, the ministry has promised, well, it was a couple of years ago, but they promised that they would try hard to turn those permits around within kind of 2 months, so that you're not waiting a long time to dewater your stuff. I hope that helps. I'll read your question later on and see if I can get back to you. Any other questions, Kaylee?
Yeah, so would DFO need to be involved if a new water treatment plant is proposing to discharge to an existing sewer system that discharges to the ocean?
I would suspect yes. Because just because you're discharging to an existing pipe that goes to the ocean, you're putting something new in there. So you're going to want to, yeah, check with both DFO, and you may also want to check with, check under the BC EAA and the reviewable projects regulation, because there are limits to the amount of waste that you can discharge, and wastewater treatment plants are specifically regulated under the BC EA. If you're ever in doubt, it never hurts to send a line to the regulator and say, hey, this is what we're doing. You know, does this fall under your jurisdiction? Or, you know, or ask an environmental consultant. We'll ask you a bunch of details, and then we'll kind of look at the minutia of, okay, this is what you're doing. Here are the rules. How does it work? Any other questions, Kelly?
Yes, so we have, can you speak to how you advise around effective protection under SARA? A bit concerning to hear the go-to is salvage and relocation, as this is a contentious issue. What sort of post-relocation or translocation monitoring do you implement?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there's, yeah, I would say there's probably, you know, salvage and relocation, I guess, depending on the species, may be the go-to for some. Part of the issue is SARA seems to protect the species, and I believe there's some gray area there. I believe their habitats on federal land, but if you are on provincial land, only the species is protected. Their habitats are not. So there's a bit of a gap in terms of species at risk, and that's why I mentioned that the I'm anticipating that gap may be filled by the province if they sort of give their species, they have their own species at risk lists, but they don't necessarily have teeth. Like, it doesn't really mean anything. There's no regulatory these species are protected if they're listed like this. So they have a bunch of lists, but they're not necessarily protected per se. And if I'm wrong, by all means, please correct me, but this is my understanding from what I've seen. So there's a bit of a gap in the regulations. So yeah, often it is, you know, kind of salvage, and it is kind of disappointing because those species are not necessarily protected. For salvage and relocation monitoring, particularly amphibians, like say we're moving egg masses from one location to another. Like I know we had a constructed pond that had a bunch of amphibian eggs in it. We moved it to another location. I think we're doing monitoring for at least a couple of years just to see. I think there was some new habitat. It was kind of a nice mix. There was some new habitat that had been constructed. We moved our eggs in, and we're doing monitoring for, I think, 2 years. Typically monitoring somewhere between, I guess, 1 and 5 years, usually 2 to 5. I think 1 year is pretty low. Usually we monitor for a bit more than that. I think that's typical, but it really depends on the species and kind of the sensitivity of what you're doing and the resilience of the species being moved and the habitat that it's being moved into. Next question, Kaylee.
All right, the last question we have here is, does Pynchon have a current regional contact list for FOC that we can share following the webinar?
A regional contact list for Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Yeah, I could probably dig one up. It depends. So they are regionally specific. I think the FOC contact for lower mainland would be different from the interior, which would be different from the island. So if you want to maybe send another question in terms of the specific region where you're at, then we can dig up the contact for you. Most of the contacts or regional offices do publish, you know, where their head office is, and they'll have contacts online, so you can reach out to those as well. Okay, we are over time. So thank you everyone who stuck around. Thank you so much for coming to the presentation. And thanks for all the wonderful questions and chats. And it was really nice to virtually connect with you. And I hope to see you all around. Okay, take care everyone. Bye.